Once we get started on YouTube, we'll get started. Let's see, we're about to go live, preparing. Hope everyone's doing well tonight. I see we have a bunch of people joining. Hi, Laver Duper on Instagram. We have Senshua. All right, so we are up on YouTube as well. And I think we'll let Lucy go for now and we'll get started. Okay, there she goes. All right, let's get my screen up here just a little bit. And all right. So tonight we are going to be talking about menopause. And one of the things that I hope to get across is that we're really just touching the surface when it comes to having sort of an understanding of things. And also, you know, I'm not an expert when it comes to hormonal issues. I am aware of various things that we'll go through tonight, but I also learned quite a bit in terms of my preparation for tonight's class about menopause. I was also going to be doing it on something called andropause, which is sort of what men go through, but the topic of menopause is so huge in terms of societal issues and cultural connotations, the language that we use, recommendations, the tips, all these things are very, very, I should say, difficult when it comes to putting it all together in sort of a short, brief class. So we'll do our best when it comes to that, but I think you'll learn a lot of things. I have to say that I learned quite a bit going through and working on this particular class on menopause. So with that said, let me go to share my screen here. Okay. And you should see on my screen, I see we have a bunch of people more coming in on the Zoom call. All right, so let me blow up my screen here and we'll get started. If anyone has any questions, please do let me know. So I entitled this class, Understanding Menopause, and we're going to be going through various different factors when it comes to having a clear understanding of this. We're going to go through societal understandings. We'll talk about the Premarin fiasco, because understanding what happened with Premarin, which was a synthetic horse estrogen that was given to women. Some women actually are, I believe some women are still on it. Understanding what went wrong with Premarin gives us a really deep insight into why, when you see news reports about studies, and they can be very, very misleading. When you understand really what happened with Premarin, you'll really start to have a clearer understanding of, you know, of how the news media actually deals with, you know, dealing with things like observational studies. Well, we'll get to it when we do it. And then we'll also talk about how to reduce the chronic disease risk that comes with menopause. Before I do that, however, I wanted to give a thank you to two people. It's all the way up here, sorry. Blow that up a little bit. So there are two people I'd like to give special thanks to. One is a continuing education course that I read through that helped me a lot with this, and that person who put that together is Dr. Allison Yick Flanagan from Walden University School of Social Work, and also Dr. Margaret Christensen, who's a functional medicine doctor and board certified OBGYN with 23 years of practice. And they really, their work had really helped me put things together when it comes to understanding all of these different things. Hello, Nuru. Hello, Colored Outside. Hello, Marie on Instagram. All right, so first we're going to jump into having a better societal understanding of menopause. As I said, we'll then get into how there is a construction of meaning around menopause. In other words, what it means to one person is so very different and is broken down on cultural lines. And it's a very, very interesting thing that has very direct impacts on how people experience menopause. There's, as you'll see as we go through the course, how there's a lot of cultural attitudes that sometimes are just sort of taken up by women. And then when they go through menopause, that's sort of how they see it through the lens of certain cultures. So when you start to understand that, it allows you to see things from a different perspective. So let's just jump right into it. And let me shrink my screen down a little bit, and we'll close some of these things here. So general definitions: menopause is a natural event that occurs when a woman has missed her menstrual cycle for 12 consecutive months, not explained by other medical factors. And for people on Instagram, I'm going through what's called a mind map. And I'll be going through everything, so you won't feel like you're missing out on anything on YouTube, on Instagram. So menopause, what are the symptoms? Well, we all know, of course, everyone knows hot flashes. And in one study, specifically a study done by the Life Extension Foundation, 59% of women experienced hot flashes. 58% of women experienced night sweats. 50% of women actually developed trouble sleeping. And then it was broken down into a whole bunch of different things: restlessness, moodiness, depression, decreased libido, anxiety, forgetfulness, stiff joints, and food cravings. The interesting thing about food cravings and menopause is that 51% of these women in this particular survey done by the Life Extension Foundation, 51% report that the intensity of food cravings was actually equal to the appetites they had during their periods. And actually 24% of them reported them as more intense. And so dealing with food cravings, some young women think that maybe that goes away, but unfortunately, it's one of those things that actually doesn't tend to go away. In general, in the United States, menopause occurs around the age of 51 years. And there are different cultural things that we'll get into, and the reasons behind them, why certain ethnic groups actually go into menopause, have a tendency, higher risk of going into menopause a little bit sooner, and others a little bit longer. When it comes to symptom reporting, there was a study called the Study for Women's Health Across the Nation, which was called, abbreviated, the SWAN study. African American and Hispanic women were more likely to experience early menopause. African American women were more likely to have night sweats. Asian American women were the opposite, and they experienced less symptoms. White women were more likely to report depression, irritability, forgetfulness, and headaches. And actually, in a separate Indian study, Southeast Asian Indian, 17% of women only reported hot flashes. And actually 94% of women welcomed menopause because in certain parts of India, they actually gained status and prestige when it comes to entering into menopause. And this is sort of the beginning of what we're going to be talking about a little bit, just in terms of how culture molds a lot of the experience. And when it molds the mental experience, there's no question that it's going to have an impact on the physical experience, because how we see things, how we perceive them is going to actually affect the way we experience them, whether we interpret them. I'm not just speaking about menopause here, but anything in general, that when we have a certain feeling about what that represents, then the physical complaint manifestation is always going to vary when it comes to understanding it and experiencing it. And there have been a lot of people who have done very advanced studies when it comes to understanding menopause. And I think this is important. I think actually probably almost more for men than women, in the sense that I don't think that a lot of men have a real appreciation for what the change in women represents, what menopause represents. And so we're going to go through in general what I learned about how sociology and people have done studies and academic, theoretical work about menopause. So, and how it's seen is you could basically look at these as if they are lenses that people look through with certain beliefs and how they see menopause. So the first is a biomedical model. And the biomedical model, as you could probably imagine, is basically looking at it only as a biological change. And unfortunately, this usually carries negative connotations. And the reason is because when you look at it solely through biological mechanisms, you're seeing a decrease in function. And unfortunately, that is going to lead to a negative perception when it comes to looking at menopause. There's the feminist model, and this is basically where they emphasize the importance of exploring the experiences, menopausal experiences, within the context of race, ethnicity, culture, gender, class, and other social locations in order to better understand the complexities of the biological and social phenomenon, particularly in light of how these social factors lead to oppression and marginalization. It's sort of the feminist lens of menopause. And when you frame things as a deficiency disease, which is sort of, unfortunately, the way the biomedical model sort of looks at it, then you are, as it says here, assumes that the aging women's bodies are flawed in some way. And for the feminist model, this perpetuates gender inequality. Betty Friedan has said, aging is not lost youth, but a new stage of opportunity and strength. And so there are other ways of looking at this. The next one is a psychoanalytical model, which is somewhat crazy, I believe. And I think there's, I'm not a fan of psychoanalysis for many different reasons, but there is a psychoanalytic model to this, which is related to castration anxiety. It's somewhat ridiculous. Then there's a sociological model. And in this, it's basically theorists recognize the importance of examining how medicine, culture, and gender interact to influence women's experiences with menopause. And also, looking at it through this lens, these people believe that menopausal experiences are socially constructed, that each woman constructs her own reality and attaches meaning to life events. And I think this one, I think all of you who are listening, especially women who have gone through menopause, I think that this particular model where we are looking at how menopausal experiences are socially constructed and how they are viewed is going to be very important as we go through the rest of the lecture. Because one of the things we want to focus in on tonight is that there are things that can be done to minimize and actually somewhat get rid of some of the negatives that come along, biological negatives that come along with menopause. So let's talk a little bit about some popular beliefs. So popular beliefs in sort of American culture, sometimes it's referred to the M word, or it's, quote, change of life. And these words, where sometimes you don't necessarily want to outright say menopause, sort of indicate the fact that in the West, sometimes there can be not so positive depictions of menopause. But if we look around the world, and we'll get into more here, in the Bible, it's an interesting, it says, Sarah had ceased to have the way of women, and she laughed when God, told her that, she was going to have a baby. And actually, it's a very interesting thing that in the Bible, when it says that, she also says, I'm old, I can't have a child. And she also says that Abraham is also too old to be able to cooperate, so to speak. And when God confronts Abraham, he actually says, he specifically avoids repeating what Sarah said about his manliness, It's one of those sort of interesting things in the Bible. But there was a article, a very good article written by a Jewish American woman by the name of Tanya Elfersey, and she wrote, "It's a period of awakening, a time when we are supposed to wise up and learn how good health and happiness are created for the rest of our lives." And I think it's another way of just expressing how many different lenses there are to look at when it comes to looking at and understanding menopause. So let's talk a little bit now about sort of the construction of meaning behind menopause. And each one of these things that we're going to discuss is another lens of looking at menopause and how various cultures look at these things. Now, each one that I'm going to go through, I don't want to spend all that much time on them, but each one of these things is associated with various different cultures. I didn't list all the different cultures because it would be too long of a lecture, and I'm not certainly an expert in this, but there are many different connotations around the world when it comes to understanding menopause. The first is a celebration of growth and maturity. And various cultures have this around the world. But on the other hand, there's another one where it's called bad blood. I believe this was in Nigeria and in some other, I think Cyprus or something like that, where there was, no, it wasn't Cyprus, but in Nigeria and some other culture where they felt like that since there wasn't an expression of menstruation every month, that there was a retention in toxins and a retention in, quote, bad blood. Other cultures refer to it as a normal part of life. Some cultures actually report it as freedom. One of the words is that in one culture is actually related to the word freedom. Again, we're looking at it from the perspective of how do we see it through various different lenses. Some cultures also view it as a loss of youth and physical attractiveness, psychological loss, and all of these things are framed around how menopause is viewed through language. In the West, the menopause is unfortunately, as we discussed, somewhat related to looking at it from a biological model, meaning that it's linked to a malfunction in women's bodies, which unfortunately can carry a negative connotation. In various Arab cultures, it's actually is described as, quote, a desperate age or a hopeless age, which are negative, obviously negative connotations. Native American or First Nation peoples, some don't have any specific word for it at all. It's just described for what it is. So when you don't have a word for that, it's usually a positive connotation. Of course, we all know the example of how the Eskimos have, 20 words for, snow. It's all sort of that cliche that they have 20, all these words for snow, powdery snow and, compressible snow, and they need to be able to communicate with one word, the conditions of snow. And the same thing goes just in terms of general culture with words and how we describe words. And we have a lot of words for something. It means we have a more nuanced appreciation or a nuanced understanding of what's actually happening. And it's telling that Native American and First Nation people don't really have, some tribes do not have a actual specific word for it. Japan, it basically means a natural transition. So we're getting to the background of sort of the, I would say, sort of academic, or I should say psychological, cultural understandings of menopause. And I guess the big takeaway here is that all of these things prove very conclusively that you can look at this, you can define, looking at separating culture from it, you can sort of define these things for yourself. because it can be looked at so many different ways, experienced in so many different ways, even though the side effects, or I should say the symptoms, are run across various cultures, with obviously some cultures experiencing, some ethnicities experiencing more symptoms than others. Nonetheless, they go across various different cultures, but the way it's experienced, the way it's looked at, the way it's emotionally dealt with is so variable and so different that one could choose to look at it really any way they want and deal with the biological factors in a very specific way, which we'll get into in just a moment. Again, if anyone has any questions, let me know. So far we've spoken a little bit about the societal understanding, and then the meaning that menopause has been given through societies, and then also culturally how women experience it. Now I'd like to get into Premarin. Now Premarin and the Premarin fiasco, and the reason I want to go into that is because, as I said in the very beginning, when you have a clear understanding of what went on with Premarin, it gives you a really good appreciation of why the media overblows nutritional studies so much. You get an understanding of when you see the headline that, 1 egg per week causes, whatever percent increase in heart disease, gives you a better understanding of why you need to be cautious when you get your nutritional information from the news. So let's talk a little bit about Premarin. Now, Premarin, if someone's not aware, most people probably are, was a synthetic estrogen that was basically isolated from horse urine. It's it binds to estrogen receptors, but it's actually a horse estrogen that's isolated from the urine. Now, the first thing that you think of is, that is somewhat crazy. I mean, what are the chances that that's going to be safe? Now, of course, you have to do studies and prove these things, but right off the bat, you might be thinking to yourself, well, I mean, horse estrogen is obviously not going to interact with a human in a probably not in a very positive way. Now, in the beginning, what were called observational studies. Now, let's get a clear understanding of what an observational study is. So let's say you have two friends. You have Mary, who is a school teacher, and she goes to sleep early, and she always eats 3 square meals a day. She's a vegetarian. She doesn't smoke or drink, and she doesn't engage in any sort of risky behavior. So that's Mary. And then you have a friend, I will call her Agnes. Now, Agnes is a female stunt double. And she smokes, she loves bacon and fried foods. And in her spare time, in addition to being a stunt woman, she likes to go parachuting. So we have Mary and we have Agnes. Now, who do you think is going to live longer? Well, the obvious answer is, Mary is going to probably live longer. She goes to sleep on time. She's vegetarian. She, doesn't engage in any risky behaviors. And then she's vegetarian. Now, if I said to you that I looked at that and I made the conclusion that the reason that she's living longer is because she's a vegetarian, and I didn't include, if I just said that, that would be an observational study, meaning I'm making the conclusion that basically that she is going to, that vegetarians therefore are, and this is just an example, vegetarians are therefore going to live longer. Now, the problem with this is, of course, that is taken out of context. It's not taking into account all the other factors that are involved. Well, if you do that, with a drug and you just, or a food for that matter, if you just say, using the example, and I'm not drawing any conclusions here. Let's say we are using the example of eggs, and you're just looking at the observation that people with eggs are, dying at a higher rate. If it's just observational, then it's not taking into account their vitamin status. It's not going to take into account their, maybe people who eat eggs, engage in riskier behaviors, or maybe they smoke more. All of these things are not taken into account. And so the best thing that an observational study can do is to give you a theory. So let's say you do an observational study, and most of these nutritional ones, just for your information, the way they do them is food survey questionnaires. And in these food survey questionnaires, they're basically, the people are trying to recall what they ate. And of course, that comes with its own negatives. And they are not looking at confounding factors, generally speaking. Or if they're, and when I mean confounding factors, is like taking out people who say are smokers. So because that's going to be a negative confounding factor, you take it out, so those people are removed from the study so that you can get a better comparison. Now, that's going to help a little bit, but it's not going to get rid of the problems with observational studies. So really, when you're dealing with an observational study, and the media, when they see these observational studies, some of the conclusions are sometimes completely outlandish. Just as an example, in the dermatology literature, there was a study many years ago that said that people who use Retin-A, they died at a younger age, or something of that sort. Now, there are just so many confounding factors that it's somewhat of an absurd, absurd conclusion that was drawn. But somehow, when they're looking at various other studies, sometimes something stands out, and they say, oh, and then people want to publish, so they write an article, and then the article comes out. But sometimes these things there's so many quote confounding factors that aren't looked at that you can't make anything but a very loose theory that maybe there's some association. And that's really what's happening with these observational studies. Now, getting back to Premarin and the Premarin fiasco, the initial studies were basically observational, and they did remove out smoking as a confounding factor, but things like sleep, environmental toxins, stress, vitamin status, obesity, none of these things were removed. And essentially, this led to Premarin being the #1 drug in the world for many, many years. And that is not the proper way to do a study. These observational studies, as I said, only should lead to a theory. And then if the theory is that it leads to, if the theory is that Premarin is, the initial studies being observational, showing that there is an improvement in health, then that's just a theory. It's not, shouldn't be necessarily be enough to stake a claim of fact, which ultimately led to Premarin being, again, the #1 drug for many, many years. It was, worth literally billions of dollars. And when proper studies were done, and when a proper study, the proper studies were actually called the Women's Health Initiative and the HERS trial. Now, these were double-blind, placebo-controlled studies. And what does that mean? Basically means that that the women didn't know if they were getting a placebo, or they didn't know if they were getting a placebo or they were getting Premarin. And the study doctors, those giving out the medications and following those patients, didn't know if they were getting a placebo or Premarin. Now, why is it that you need to have the examiner and the doctor also be quote blinded, not knowing whether or not they have been given the medicine or the placebo? And the reason is because there could be a subconscious interaction that could potentially impact the outlook of the outcome of the result. Maybe they smile more, or provide more care because they know that the person's getting the medication. This is why these double-blind placebo-controlled studies are so important. Now, you can't do that all the time with nutritional studies, obviously, because you would have to almost lock people up to be able to say, well, one, they couldn't be double-blinded. You couldn't necessarily, let's say you were testing eggs as an example, you couldn't, either you're giving the person eggs or not, but you could do a non-double-blinded, a single-blinded. Actually, it'd be difficult to do single-blinded because both people are going to know if they're getting eggs or not. But you could still create something where you account for all the most as many confounding factors as possible to try to get to a result that is going to give you some tangible information. So what happened? Well, these properly done studies, the Women's Health Initiative and the HERS trial, basically showed 50% increased heart attack, increased endometrial and breast cancer, accelerated Alzheimer's, dementia as well. Unbelievable. And it just goes to show that, there was a lot of money involved here that no doubt played a role in the fact that an observational study was done initially and actually was essentially approved, allowed it to be approved. And again, it's a good parable almost, or at least sort of instructional understanding of what really happens. You see, another thing that sort of happens is when they compare certain things together, like if they say, for example, that, if they cut fat by a certain percentage, or if they, well, that's going to go down a whole other, I don't want to go down a rabbit hole too much, but basically, that's really what happened with Premarin. And I think it's a very important thing to understand. So let's go into reducing chronic risk and the practical things that we can talk about when it comes to getting rid of the problems that happen with the biological problems that can happen with menopause. So by 2030, 1.2 billion women will be there'll be 1.2 billion menopausal women. And so this is reducing the chronic disease risk is a world health issue. We want people to be as healthy as possible. And when it comes to menopause, as Dr. Christensen said in one of the interviews that I read, lifestyle changes modulate hormonal functional health, lowering and even reversing the risk of these chronic issues. So she's saying, with all of her experience, that if you're able to make substantial lifestyle changes, the natural changes and risks that happen when you have menopause can be reversed. So what are some of these things? Well, there's some impaired endothelial function due to dropping in estrogen levels. And we know that, there is a protective effect against heart disease, a certain protective effect that goes away when menopause comes and therefore leads to an increase in heart disease, gastroenteritis, rheumatoid arthritis, chronic fatigue syndrome, diabetes, hypertension, which actually was associated somewhat directly with obesity, and overall cardiometabolic risk, which basically means heart, and metabolic, meaning, having issues with blood sugar, et cetera. Let's talk about anti-inflammatory foods very, very narrowly. And obviously, if you're eating a lot of fruits and vegetables, that is going to be helpful. But there actually is one particular thing that's found in cruciferous vegetables called glucosinolates that helps suppress hormonal modulated female cancers. And actually, it does something to estrogen metabolites that allows them to be cleared in a different way. Cruciferous vegetables, of course, I've spoken about week in and week out. So these are kale, collards, broccoli, mustard greens, etc. And these can help with hormonal balance. In fact, I've seen a great deal of improvement in women, especially that are having hormonally based acne, who increase the increased cruciferous vegetable intake. Carotenoids and fruit and have also been shown to actually cause people to enter menopause later, at a later age. And I should say that, we spoke a little bit earlier about how Asian American women have a higher rate of moving into menopause at a later age, and African American and Hispanic women moving into menopause at an earlier age. And some of those differences change as Asian American so there was one study done in the UK that showed that East Asian Indian in the UK, when they adopted the lifestyle of the UK, meaning diet and everything else, those differences disappeared. So there's no question that we're dealing here with an issue that is probably the majority of the issue related to diet. So as much as you can get fruits and vegetables, obviously with a particular interest in cruciferous vegetables, that's going to be helpful. The general studies, though, that have been done have really revolved around the Mediterranean diet. So the question is what is the Mediterranean diet? There's so many different things, but so many different descriptions of the Mediterranean diet. I mean, we're talking the Mediterranean region, is huge, from Greece to Italy to France. I mean, it's huge. And all of those are very different diets. So how do we come to an understanding of the Mediterranean diet? Well, we're basically talking about lots of vegetables, fish, olive oil, that sort of diet. And that has, of course, been shown to have reduced atherosclerosis. It's found to be cardioprotective. And fish oil has actually been demonstrated to at least improve the lipid profiles of people, and women especially, in these studies, that is, to have a more favorable lipid profile. So reading about the Mediterranean diet, a lot of people think that's a lot of salmon and whole grains and things like that. It's usually, again, high vegetable intake, seafood, yes, some whole grains and such, but I think we have a general conception, but sometimes, a whole big plate of pasta is not a Mediterranean diet, even if you can get that in Italy. So that's just something to be aware of. Let's talk about vasomotor symptoms. So that specifically is hot flashes and night sweats. So one study showed that vegans had less symptoms than omnivores. It doesn't necessarily mean you have to be vegan. Again, we're talking about how the Mediterranean diet can be so incredibly powerful. One study compared the lacto-ovo vegetarians, so those that eat eggs and dairy, with olive oil, and the lacto-ovo vegetarians that took a fish oil supplement. And those that took the fish oil supplement, the lacto-ovo vegetarians, actually did better. And most recently, there's been some study to show that there is actually some link to increased risk of cardiovascular disease when it comes to having hot flashes and night sweats. Now, I think, we're going through all of these different things, and I think that we should, one of the things that I'll just give an example with my mother. My mother essentially is in training mode. Like, she doesn't want to deal with any of she wants to stay as young as she possibly can. And so she's adopted a training mentality. And, I used to, when I lived in Santa Monica, I had a very famous fitness expert that lived in my building. and I had been following his work for a very long time. And one day I got into the elevator and he was there. And I was, of course, a bit starstruck because he's a pretty, I learned a great deal of information from him. And so every time I saw him after that, he would ask me how my training was. And the first time he said, "How's your training?" I thought to myself, I'm not training for anything. But, as he continued, as I would bump into him in the elevator, and he probably was, he probably hated seeing me because I always had some peculiar question about training, about physical exercise, that is. And then he would say, "I hope your training's going well." And at some point I realized that you have to be training. In other words, your mentality and the lens that you see things is that you are training. You need to be training to fight, the things that are naturally coming at you as a result of aging. This is not just for men, or it's not just for women, it's for men, it's for pretty much everyone, because we want to contribute to our life in the best way that we possibly can. And we want to be able to express and be with our families and express love. And we do that best when we are at our healthiest. And so this concept of putting yourself in training mode gives you a different way of looking at it. Like, yes, you are in training. And the sooner you realize that you need to step up and realize you need to train to be, you're in training. You're training to be healthy. You're training to reverse natural decline. You're training to feel better. And you are an athlete. Essentially you have to consider yourself that, because life, there's nothing harder than what life throws at you. And so you're training for life. And that includes obviously mental and physical training. So if I bump into you somewhere, I'm going to ask you how your training is. Okay, let's get back to weight gain and menopause. So again, this was a result of Life Extension Foundation survey. 69% of people who gained weight gained an average of 18 pounds with menopause. 82% reported that it was harder to lose weight, reduced energy, and disrupted sleep. And we really have to look at things from a very wide perspective when it comes to weight gain, which means that we can't rely on the understanding that it's just some hormonal change and therefore the hormones are causing me to gain weight. We have to look at it from a more holistic perspective, which basically is reduced energy is going to be a result, which is going to impact you. Disrupted sleep is going to cause you to have a problem. So when it comes to reduced energy, what are you going to do? Well, of course, exercise. Exercise has to be weight bearing. And the reason is because with weight bearing exercise, that can reduce the incidence of osteoporosis. So things like yoga, just yoga as an example, my girlfriend had a DEXA scan before she started yoga and after, and her bone density increased substantially. So you have to be, swimming might not be the best exercise. There should be jumping, there should be, jump rope or some sort of running or even walking or some basic aerobics. And then you have to be doing resistance training. The age of, just doing a time check. The age of just doing aerobics, that's been proven not to be a good way to maintain health. You have to do some sort of either body weight exercise or weights. And the results are incredible. In other words, the amount of increased strength that you can get at just about any age with the start of some sort of weight-bearing exercise is remarkable. When it comes to reduced energy, prayer, meditation, inner directed relaxation. So that's incredibly important to balance out the nervous system, which is something we've spoken about at length. And then disrupted sleep, which is also going to lead to weight gain because, again, that's going to cause reduced energy. It's also going to have actually hormonal impact. So it affects insulin, which is going to affect weight loss if you have disrupted sleep. So practicing good sleep hygiene, and I spoke about that at length several weeks ago in a class about how to optimize your house for health. And we're going to conclude with food cravings, because without tackling food cravings, we're really not going to get anywhere when it comes to the unfortunate possible natural weight gain that can happen with menopause. 59% and 59% of women had sweet cravings. 46% had salty cravings. When it comes to food textures, 48% of women craved crunchy foods, and cold foods were, I didn't write down the number, but it was also an incredibly high number. Also spoke about having cold foods. So when it comes to sweet and salty, of course, you can Google all kinds of things these days to find healthy snack options. So when it comes to a sweet, learning to develop an appreciation for natural fruits is something that I've spoken about in many different classes about how we need to get rid of artificially sweetened things so that our palate can actually appreciate and have enjoyment from natural fruits. Low sugar fruits like berries, strawberries, blackberries, blueberries, these are all low sugar fruits. Baked carrot chips, as an example, you can slice carrot chips, you can use a little bit of olive oil, put a little bit of salt and cumin and bake them. It's delicious. So-called energy bites, where you can put a date with peanut butter or almond butter with some oats or flaxseed. That's also a really good one. Roasted chickpeas. There's some great YouTube videos. There's one woman on YouTube who I really like, who has a good recipe for this, but many other recipes. I think her name is like, I can't remember, but it's like Italian grandmother cooks food or something like that. Put that into YouTube. She's really great and has lots of different recipes. Hummus with homemade crackers. I do a homemade cracker made from the pulp of the juice that I make, but I'm also going to show you in just a moment a recipe from Dr. Joel Furman, which is a very good recipe for making your own chips, because quite frankly, I crave crunchy sometimes too, but unfortunately, there are very few chips that are going to be contributory to your overall health. And it's best if you can come up with a different sort of, option. Roasted chickpeas can be very crunchy and salty as well, so you can get that as well. Here's the recipe that it was just funny that it was posted not just recently as I was putting this together. So it's basically flax, chia, sesame, hemp, pumpkin, cashews, spinach, tomato sauce, nutritional yeast, apple cider vinegar, garlic, onion, oregano, chili powder, and that's basically made into a cracker, put onto parchment paper, and put in the oven. I haven't made this one completely, but I've certainly, again, when I do my juice on occasion, then I'll take the pulp and I'll mix in flax, sesame, and hemp seeds, and then I'll put it in the dehydrator or put it on the lowest setting, and it gets this incredibly crunchy taste that you can use in hummus, and it's very satisfying snack. And we'll follow that up, and we'll end tonight actually talking about the craving of cold food, and basically the solution to ice cream is frozen banana ice cream. And when I was a little kid, there was actually this place in Ocean City, New Jersey, where they would put a banana through what looked like a meat grinder, and it would come out, and they would top it with different things. And people would wait in line for like an hour for this. And the texture you get from just blending up a frozen banana is indistinguishable from ice cream. And my mouth is watering just thinking about it. And what you can do is, one, if you have a juicer, like a horizontal juicer, it actually has an attachment that you can use, but you can also just take a good blender, throw in a frozen banana, blend it up, scoop it out, and then top it with raw cacao, which is what I like to do to make sort of a chocolate. Cinnamon, peanuts, almonds, coconut flakes, whatever your imagination can come up with. It's an incredible way of having a healthy dessert. And quite frankly, it's important because things like ice cream are just not going to be contributory to your health. So, and even a touch of cream, if you wanted to add a little bit of a teaspoon or something of cream on top and sort of mix it in, you can kind of get a creamy flavor as well. And that's for satisfying those cold foods. See, essentially, not just for who we're talking about tonight, but for everyone, if you have a certain craving, you really need to be able to have options for you to be able to get through that. So that is tonight's class. Just to review what we went over briefly, and then we'll say goodnight. we essentially went through various societal understandings of menopause. We talked about how women give meaning, how that construction of meaning happens, whether it's through cultural means or whether it's symptomatology. We spoke about the Premarin fiasco when it comes to understanding why certain observational studies are no good. And then we talked about how to reduce the chronic disease risk. I see there's a question. One moment. And so, as I mentioned at the beginning, I decided not to talk about andropause tonight because this was such a huge topic. And we will do that on another class. There was just too much to go through when it comes to menopause. But needless to say, there are some things that happen with men that are different than what happened with women. But the topic of menopause is such a bigger topic that I decided to do andropause, which is what it's being called now, at another date. So thank you everyone for attending tonight's class. I appreciate everyone. I see some more people came into the class. And next week, we'll be talking about adaptogens, which are basically things like herbs that can basically help you with stress, that have biological effects. And in other words, they can help you calm down, but they can also help you need energy as well. They remarkably, it's very interesting how they work, but they can balance you out in two different ways. A whole bunch of herbs that are adaptogens. And then the week after that, we're going to be talking about getting a clear understanding of sugar, different types of sugar, glucose, fructose, sucrose. And when you have an understanding of that, you're really able to choose sweet in a very, very, I guess, educated way, because when you really get a clear understanding of it, you're not going to have any confusion when it comes to incorporating sweet into your diet. So that's it. Thank you again for your attention tonight. And what can I say? I appreciate all of everyone here and your attention tonight. And I look forward to seeing you next week. Have a great night.